Many US cities have undergone a massive wave of immigration, most notably New York.
Migrant from Venezuela.
Violent outbursts and groups of people causing conflicts and expenses to the inhabitants and authorities have tested the city's patience. While New York and the United States as a whole have historically been hubs for a constant influx of immigrants, this wave feels different. And it is different. The origins of this immigration wave have not been fully identified, and certainly not addressed, meaning the flow of people will continue. People will continue to do the impossible, even risking their lives on the secondary roads and railroads of Central and North America, just to be detained and processed at our southern border, in a long shot at a chance to integrate with our economy. Venezuela, formerly the richest country on the continent, has now become the greatest exporter of immigrants. Thousands of its citizens now comprise a large portion of the current immigration wave, not just in the United States, but across the entire continent. What is the reason for this radical shift? We spoke with Anya Parampil, journalist and author. Her latest book, Corporate Coup, Venezuela and the End of U.S. Empire, presents a detailed account of how a shadow regime with deep connections to transnational corporations and intelligence agencies sought to overturn the revolution and take complete control of Venezuelan resources. Hey Anya, thanks for being with us.
My pleasure, Oscar. Nice to be talking to you.
We have been studying the factors that influence the current migration wave. As you know, migration waves change, and it's different, from the beginning when there were Mexicans coming back and forth, mostly undetected. Then that changed. It became the Hondurans, the Nicaraguans, the Salvadorans, escaping their own horrible realities. It also meant that children and vulnerable people surrendered to US authorities at the border by the thousands. That migration wave produced images of children in cages, if we remember, starting from 2014 and reaching a peak under Trump in 2018, 2019, when the policy of family separation was in effect, producing grotesque images, but not fundamental change. And now everything has changed. We have a new and very different migration wave, composed mostly of families from Venezuela, Ecuador, and Haiti, escaping violence, but mostly economic devastation. These people are going through inhuman conditions just to get to Mexico, let alone the United States. They do all this because Venezuela was destabilized. Those migrants from Venezuela initially migrated to the rest of South America and faced challenges as they tried to make a living there. As the economic crisis in the world worsens, they had to move out of those countries and head north. So let's talk about why did they have to leave Venezuela, and what do you think is the level of responsibility of corporate empire in all of this?
Well, I would say the corporate empire has a role in all of those migration waves you describe. NAFTA driving the Mexican migration wave, the coup in Honduras that overthrew the democratically elected president of Jose Manuel Zelaya in 2008 or 9, driving the coup driving the migration wave from Honduras. A violent regime change episode in Nicaragua, where the U.S. funded violent militias, essentially terrorists in the street, in an attempt to overthrow their democratically elected government. And in this most recent case, Venezuela, there is also once again a direct line to draw to U.S. policy and how it fomented by design a collapse of Venezuela's economy. And this is something I detail in the book, not through my own opinion. Yes, I go to Venezuela and I interview Venezuelans and I give people who live under U.S. sanctions a voice, and they blame U.S. policy for their plight. Many of them do. Of course, there are supporters of the opposition who take an approach where they blame the government for corruption, but these opinions I kind of contextualize with hard data and research that's not my own, but from other sources, including an opposition economist named Francisco Rodriguez, who is a Harvard-trained economist, currently teaches at the University of Denver in Colorado. He released a study that actually charted with data the most significant drops in Venezuelan oil production, which serve as the basis for Venezuela's economy. The oil industry does, because Venezuela has the largest oil reserves in the world. And since oil was discovered there about 100 years ago, that has fueled its economy. So Francisco maps these drops and shows that each of them directly correlated, other than the 2008 financial collapse, which the world experienced. And then around that time, there was also a sharp drop in oil prices in the world. It's a side story, but Secretary of State John Kerry actually went to Saudi Arabia at that time to lobby for Saudi Arabia to increase production so that they would crash the oil economy in order to put pressure on Iran, another oil-based economy, during negotiations for the JCPOA or Iran deal. So this is how the U.S. weaponizes the oil industry just more broadly. But when it came to Venezuela, after that one blip in the oil economy that was driven by the international crash, 3 other significant drops occurred that were immediately or directly traced to a U.S. sanction levied against Venezuela's economy or its oil industry in particular. And so Francisco told me that this data result was the statistical equivalent of a smoking gun, essentially to demonstrate that the pressure on Venezuela's economy corresponded with U.S. action on 3 separate drops. The main significant drops is to prove essentially that U.S. policy drove Venezuela's decline. He called U.S. sanctions a surgical strike on Venezuela's oil industry. And again, this is only one opinion. I have other expert opinions, including a UN rapporteur, Special Rapporteur Alfred de Zayas, who visited Venezuela, filed a separate report saying that U.S. sanctions amounted to a medieval siege on Venezuela, and other studies as well, including from a DC-based think tank that demonstrates U.S. sanctions caused thousands of excess deaths in the country. So that is one part of the argument I could make to say that U.S. policy is responsible for this latest migration crisis. There's no question that the U.S. conducted a controlled demolition of Venezuela's economy. And the height of this attack was actually in 2015. That's when Venezuelan refugees began leaving en masse from the country. That was the height of their economic suffering in Venezuela. In order to understand the current wave, I think it's crucial to note that the COVID crisis, the response in South America that then shut down the informal economies of Peru, Chile, Argentina, Colombia, many of the countries, Ecuador, where these Venezuelan migrants initially went, suddenly it's like they were living under sanctions again, except this time it was a global sanction, a crackdown on the lives of ordinary people everywhere. And so they were suffering. They were suffering more in some cases than they even had in Venezuela, which is why the Venezuelan government has an official policy of chartered planes that it periodically sets up, where refugees or migrants in other countries can actually board the plane in order to get back home to Venezuela. They've repatriated thousands of Venezuelan migrants in this way. But what happened in 2020, when Biden came in 2021 as president, within months of assuming office, Biden issued a temporary protected status order for Venezuelan migrants, which basically amounts to a wet foot, dry foot policy. If you get here, Biden was telling Venezuelan migrants, you will get preferred status. You can even work without your official citizenship, and you can kind of get fast-tracked to citizenship, prioritized over other migrants. So you had these hundreds of thousands of people who'd already left the country and were realizing that life in other Latin American countries is not necessarily that much better than Venezuela. And now they're told, hey, if you can just make it to the U.S. southern border, you will get favorable status. And so that policy decision from the Biden administration, coupled with the economic war that the United States has waged on Venezuela for a decade, really, I say, places full responsibility for this catastrophe, this human catastrophe that's just not pretty, not a pretty picture any way you look at it, at the doorstep of the Biden administration and the White House more broadly, that being the Trump administration and Obama administrations that were complicit and active in this war on Venezuela.
I mean, when I was little, I remember the tales and the stories of this rich country with beautiful cars, beautiful cities, beautiful women, beautiful everything. Venezuela was at the top of South America. People seem to forget that. And we also fail to estimate the kind of blows that we've dealt to Venezuela. For example, Citgo was a Venezuelan corporation here in the States, a multi-million corporation that was taken away. Also, most Venezuelan gold was taken by the British, right? Now you get to the situation where you ask any random South America that's not very educated on the matter, they will tell you that the socialism was the problem, that socialism equals poverty, and that Venezuela's doom is doomed to the system they implanted. So it's a total demolition job they did in there. Venezuela went from the richest country in South America to the sad example they wanted to make of it. Can you help us have an idea of how much wealth was taken away from Venezuelans?
It's nearly impossible to quantify, but one important point to make on that, the issue of socialism having destroyed Venezuela, something I point out in the book is that the vast majority of Venezuela's economy is still controlled by the private sector. And that's despite over 2 decades of what the Venezuelan government describes as socialist revolution. But it's not a socialist system that we would imagine under the Soviet Union or even Cuba, for example, where the state manages pretty much everything and acts as a monopoly. That's not the case in Venezuela. Their socialism is rooted in the fact that the state has ownership and the people have ownership of the natural resources, which happen to be, as you say, make Venezuela the richest or one of the richest countries in the world. It has the largest oil reserves in the world, larger than Saudi Arabia by a double. And it has the largest untapped gold deposits in the world, as well as many other minerals that are vital for modern production. And so that is the target of this policy, is the fact that it's not good enough for the United States for Venezuela to, even though it maintains ownership of its natural resources, have engaged in some sort of commerce with the US government or private companies. No, that's not good enough for the United States. They want full control of the natural resources, and they want to cut the Venezuelan people out of the equation altogether, as they did for much of the last century. Yes, Venezuela was very rich. That's because there was international capital and industry coming to participate in its economy and lifting up a small segment of the population. So it's kind of like New York or the rich countries in the United States. Yes, it feels opulent and rich, or it was that way in Venezuela, but the vast majority of the country was made up of this toiling underclass that never had a say and never got a share of that wealth until the revolution. And so that's why the US had to work so hard to target and sabotage its oil economy, and then stand back to say that socialism is to blame. It's kind of a political tactic the United States uses to then just tarnish socialism altogether, even though when we saw those bread lines or pictures of empty supermarket shelves in Venezuela, those weren't government controlled markets. Those were controlled by the private sector, and in many instances the private sector, major importers and distributors of goods were found hoarding basic supplies in warehouses, and the government had to go around and break them open, and found like tons of toilet paper that the rich were trying to hide in order to foment this crisis and lead to the government's overthrow. But when it comes to the actual international wealth that Venezuela had, yes, there's Citgo Petroleum, which is not just gas stations, but oil pipelines and refineries here in the United States, as well as bank accounts. And the US government, as a result of this coup, actually seized all of those assets. And what I show in the book is that the people who were the main figures of this coup, driving this coup on the Venezuelan side in the United States, they were actually characters who worked for the oil industry, including Carlos Vecchio, who's the ambassador, the face of this coup in the United States. He was actually the lead lawyer battling battling Venezuela's government on behalf of ExxonMobil, his employer, for much of the beginning of the century. That was actually his job. And he was also winning all of these US government contracts to create civil society organizations and NGOs in Venezuela at the same time. So he's actually an agent of foreign capital, foreign companies. Same thing with Ricardo Hausmann, the Harvard professor who was the top economic advisor to this coup. He was an IMF and World Bank stooge who I revealed actually had gotten hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of paid speaking gigs from huge banking behemoths and corporations, leading to his resignation actually from the Guaido regime once that was exposed. And then also Jose Ignacio Hernandez, this gentleman was the attorney general representing the shadow government led by Juan Guaido. And he actually previously, before having worked in that government, or government, I should say in parentheses, was a contracted attorney for several major companies that were suing Venezuela's government in US courts and international arbitration courts. And so then when he came and took over the Venezuelan court strategy in the eyes of US courts, he took deliberate actions that resulted in these billions of dollars worth of assets from Citgo Petroleum falling into the hands of the corporations that he'd previously contracted to work for as a lawyer. So it's blatant corruption. It's a naked corporate coup. And yes, even though they didn't achieve their political goal in Venezuela, and the government is still strong and Venezuela's moved past this, the coup did have an important effect and success in actually stealing billions of dollars worth of Venezuela's wealth, including gold, actual physical gold that is sitting in the Bank of England right now in Venezuelan accounts that Nicolas Maduro, Venezuela's president, attempted to repatriate, actually lodged a formal repatriation request with the British government in 2018, months before Britain then moved to recognize a shadow government with no authority in Venezuela. Sure, that sounds like a crazy policy decision on the surface, but what London got to turn around and do as a result is say, well, since we don't actually know who controls your government because we made this weird policy of recognizing a fake imposter as your president, we can't actually give you your gold back, even though you asked for it, because we don't believe that you're the legitimate government of Venezuela. It is modern day piracy, and it's criminal, and it's only backfiring. I think it just means that in the future, foreign companies or countries and companies will not be banking in the US and London.
It's interesting to know that in the first Cold War, there was left and right, but they were two very different and distinct blocks. On the one hand, you have communism and a fundamental and conceptual desire to change the other bloc in a way. So it did somehow threaten the other bloc. But now we have a very, very different situation when we have a corporate empire, and you have, in the other side, you have nations that are trying to survive that corporate empire. And you have nations like Venezuela and others that are just trying to give their citizens the kind of service that in European countries you find readily available. Let's say, for example, France, you have education that's affordable, you have healthcare, you have infrastructure, basic infrastructure. And that's what these nations are trying to do. They're not trying to do fundamentally change like they were in the Cold War, the nations in the Cold War were trying to do. These are nations that are trying to survive within the system just at a certain level for their population. This is so much different than what we have in the Cold War, isn't it?
Yes, exactly. And I would say this is also the struggle that we have here in the United States, which is why it's so important, I think, that we shift from this framing. People, because of the Cold War and because of the propaganda, people in the United States are so brainwashed into opposing anything that mentions the word socialism, which I think is fair enough. In 2024, we should frame the discussion in terms of what people can understand. It is us, sovereign people and sovereign nations, up against a global corporate banking cartel. And these people that control our government and are responsible for these policies that have hurt countries such as Venezuela and Honduras, Ecuador, throughout all of these years, these people that are responsible also for waging wars across the Middle East and Africa and and Asia for the last, for the decade since World War II. It's all to force countries into this international global corporate system. And those people don't have our interests as Americans in their hearts either. They don't actually care about the average American living here in Washington or where you are in Arizona, Oscar. And so I think we should start to see, solidarity with the people of South America, because we are all up against the same evil axis, and they drained us. They're using our tax dollars at this point for nothing other than war, for bombs on Gaza and in Ukraine. So I think we need to point out that this elite, these people that have hijacked our government, they're working against the interests of the United States. This isn't even just as simple as imperialism anymore, because we're at this stage where the empire has really turned on itself and is kind of eating itself from the inside.